Hello, everyone. I am Gwydion Sullivan. I am the Executive Director of Penn Faulkner. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We are very lucky to have you here. Our mission is to celebrate literature and to provide connections between readers and writers that enrich and inspire us all. To achieve that mission, we run education programs that bring literary opportunities to students in low-income schools in DC. We celebrate tremendous literary achievements with the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story. We hold programs like this one that generate thrilling and provocative dialogue about big ideas, and we can't do any of that without you. So I want to thank everyone who contributed to be here tonight. I am incredibly grateful to have your support. Now, just a few quick technical notes. Live captions are provided tonight, and you can toggle them on and off using the little CC button down there at the bottom of the screen. There will be a Q&A session at the end of tonight's program, so please submit your questions using the Q&A button so we can surface the ones to get everybody started. It really doesn't work unless you all join in. So thank you in advance for submitting questions. And lastly, you can find our authors' books for sale at Politics and Prose. And we're going to drop the links to those books into the chat. And I hope you'll get them all because they're all amazing. And speaking of those books and their authors, I want to introduce our panelists tonight. First, we have Kaitlyn Greenidge, who is a contributing writer for the New York Times and the features director at Harper's Bazaar. Her debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, was one of the New York Times critics' top 10 books of 2016. Next, we have Jonathan Lee, who is the author of 4 novels, most recently The Great Mistake, as well as the editorial director of Bloomsbury. We have Quế Mai, who is the author of 8 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction in Vietnamese, and her writing has been translated and published in more than 15 countries. And our moderator tonight, Bethanne Patrick, is not only a Penn Faulkner board vice president and our literary programs committee chair, she is also a writer and critic whose reviews and profiles appear in the Los Angeles Times, on NPR Books, the Boston Globe, basically everywhere. She is a 2021 Virginia Center for the Creative Arts Fellow in nonfiction, and her memoir, Life B, will be coming out in 2023 from Counterpoint Press. And with that, Bethanne, I am going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwydion. It is great to be back on the Literary Conversation stage with 3 such amazing panelists. And I mentioned to the panelists in the green room beforehand that I've covered each of them in a very different way. And that's really exciting to me, both as a board member at Penn Faulkner and as the moderator of this conversation about historical fiction. So I'm going to ask everyone to indulge me as I read not my own words, but someone else's. And those words are from scholar and cultural critic Megan O'Grady, who a few years ago in her column in T magazine at the New York Times wrote about what she and I call the new historical fiction. And I just want to read a few lines from her piece because I think they really describe well what all 3 of the panelists tonight are engaged in as writers and what we want to talk about this evening as well. So Megan O'Grady said, "Making sense of our lives and of the unfathomable world in which we find ourselves has necessitated an understanding of what has come before. The past we inherit speaks to us individually and collectively, but a common thread, much less a consensus view of reality, feels increasingly hard to come by. As visions of the future increasingly fail in the face of our present moment, literary authors are increasingly looking back, not to comfort us with a sense of known past or even an easy allegory of the present, but instead to seek reasons for why we are the way we are and how we got here, and at what point the train began to derail. Too many for too long were left out, the true architectures of power concealed. Theirs are novels that reveal the emptiness of the old stories, destabilizing our ideas of history rather than affirming them, which is, after all, one purpose of literary fiction. In our days of sloganeering and apocryphal tweets, it's also a form of resistance. A new generation of writers is rewriting the old stories with skin very much in the game, a rebellion against history and memory. The process of remembering is, by definition, an act of imagination and invention. And the hardest stories to tell have become the stories we need most, those in which there is no tweetable takeaway, only the invisible dead, the ghosts who lie in wait. Thank you, Megan O'Grady, for those very wise words. And also, I had to read that because I spend so much time on Twitter, and she's right. There's no tweetable takeaway for the kind of historical fiction that you three are writing and working on. And so I'm going to start with a question that comes from Megan O'Grady's words. Here we are, flailing in a world filled with natural disasters, a pandemic, war. Why do we read and write historical fiction? Who wants to take on that tiny little question first? Someone unmute yourself.
I can start.
Thank you, Kaitlyn.
Well, I write it and I read history and historical fiction to remind us of our current moment is just sort of one of many moments in time. And, you know, we are living through times where sort of everything can feel like an existential threat. But I remember maybe like 5 or 6 years ago having sort of really long conversations with my mother around sort of like what does it, where is there sort of like a trajectory of how you're supposed to sort of live in times where it feels like, you know, the future feels very, very dim, and a place where maybe we don't really want to be. And she and a lot of thinkers I say that I really admire sort of remind me again and again that the world has ended many times for many different types of people. And so to forget that is sort of a privilege in and of itself, to sort of feel like this time is the only time where people have sort of felt in great calamity is itself sort of a not real narrative. And for me, I read historical fiction to remind myself that, you know, there were alternative ways of being. There have always been alternative ways of being that are much more complex than what our current moment can sort of offer us in terms of choices of how we want to live our lives in times that feel like there's real sort of danger or peril or just great uncertainty.
Thank you. And that actually is really interesting to me because it's not just about course correction. It's not just about let's get it right. It sounds like you're talking about, dare I say it, something that feels a little bit like hope, like we might learn something even in very dark times.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be, I think hope is like a really complex word because, you know, it's like one of those words that feel like everybody knows what it means, but it means very different things to different people. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of the word hope, I think of like less this idea that everything will turn out well regardless, or people will always act the way that you expect them that they're going to act, or you know, things will always follow, you know, we're all writers here. So like things will always follow a 3-act structure, you know, like somehow whatever story we're seeing is going to unfold, they'll, you know, we'll be at the critical moment and then, you know, we'll reach some sort of grand finale. But I do think of hope more as, you know, staying curious about the wider world and curious about what humans have done both in good ways and bad ways, and in also ambiguous ways throughout time, and sort of reminding ourselves of all the paths that are open sort of in every single moment that we're living through.
Thank you. Any response, Jonathan or Quay?
Oh, I really like what Kaitlyn just said. I mean, it also made me think of in the Megan O'Grady quote about there not being a tweetable takeaway. I immediately thought of a tweetable takeaway that I saw today. The tweet was like a line from a random guy on Twitter today, and he said, you know, we live our lives forward, but we understand them backward. And I don't think it was his line. I think he stole it from Kierkegaard or someone fancy like that. But I think it sort of connects with the idea we're talking about, and sort of part of the fascination of reading good historical fiction, and maybe the fascination of in writing it too, because there's that thrill of discovering an origin story, which is something we all kind of innately understand in some way, whether it's, you know, an attempt to understand the past, whatever that is, or your past or your family's past. Or in my case, I was kind of interested in writing about the origin story of New York and researching that, and I'd lived here for 10 years and just got interested in that. And there's that sense that, you know, you can write what you know, or you can write what you want to know about. And the past is obviously sort of rich territory for finding those kinds of stories Kaitlyn mentioned, where you know, there may be hope there, or there might be something really depressing in finding out that many other ages lived through the same kinds of issues, or that things haven't changed, or that things have. But there's so much kind of fertile ground to sort of dig around in, I guess.
There is a lot of fertile ground to dig around in. And sometimes in some of the latest historical fiction, people really are digging for lots and lots and lots of different reasons. So Quế Mai, one of the things I know that you are really interested in all of your work, but particularly in The Mountains Sing, is showing a completely different view of Vietnam, and in particular, its women. And I think that's quite interesting, because many avid readers are women, many readers of historical fiction are women, but many of them do not know anything about Vietnam, about the women who lived there. And so when you began writing, what was it that drew you toward historical fiction? And I know you don't always write historical fiction, correct?
Yeah. Thank you for this great panel. I really love listening to you. And so, you know, I started my writing career in Vietnamese. I started writing poetry in Vietnamese. And the more I read, the more I became frustrated at the way Vietnamese people are represented in Western fiction. A lot of, you know, I mean, if you Google Vietnam literature or Vietnam fiction, you still see titles which are written by Western writers, you know, like about the Vietnam War. So normally Vietnam is only seen as the war. And in Hollywood movies, or in a lot of books about Vietnam, Vietnamese people are not given a voice. We simply act as the background to the Western story. So I wanted to reclaim the Vietnamese narrative, you know, and put the voices of Vietnamese women in the forefront, because, like, I think I read a statistic that more women and children die because of wars and conflicts than men. But normally, you know, in talking about war narratives, you know, men are given the center stage, because we look at wars and conflict as only as the number of deaths and of the injured in the battlefield. But we don't think so much about the impact on family structures, on nature, on the fabric of the societies, and the long-lasting trauma that women and children have to inherit, and especially, you know, intergenerational trauma as well. So I want to document that in my fiction. And I think also, you know, in Vietnam, the official viewpoint is that we won the war. There is no trauma. So there has been no chance for us as a country to heal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many Vietnamese died in the war, more than 3 million Vietnamese, and many were killed by our own hands because the North and the South were fighting against each other. But, you know, officially, we don't acknowledge that. We don't have a memorial for those who fought alongside with Americans who died. So, you know, so in our culture, we believe they are wandering spirits because they are not honored, they're not acknowledged. So I think, you know, my novel deals with something very sensitive, the reconciliation among Vietnamese people ourselves. And I think when it comes to the Vietnamese conflict, that should be the center stage. It's not the trauma of American people, I'm sorry to say. Even though, you know, so many books have written about the American trauma, but when it comes to the Vietnam War, more Vietnamese people have suffered and continue to suffer and don't have the chance to heal yet. So that's why I had to write English to insert a voice from Vietnam, from Vietnamese women into the canon of literature.
I'm so glad you said what you just said about creating a voice, because our first short reading, each panelist will read tonight, is going to be from Jonathan. And I wanted to have him read because he's going to read from the very beginning of The Great Mistake. And he's giving a voice to a person who's been forgotten in so many ways, but also in The Great Mistake, Jonathan, we can talk about this later, you give voice to a part of him that has not received any voice before. So would you read for us, please, Jonathan Lee? And then we'll talk briefly about how each of you chose to introduce your particular time period. So, Jonathan.
Thanks so much. I'll just read the first paragraph of the book, which is called The Great Mistake. And it's about this guy, Andrew Haswell Green, who's a sort of forgotten civic leader in New York in the 19th century, without whom there'd be no Central Park and no New York Public Library and no Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he died on Friday, November 13th, 1903. So this is how I start. The last attempt on the life of Andrew Haswell Green took place on Park Avenue in 1903. News of his murder filled the front page of the New York Times. Father of Greater New York shot in front of his home. The motive was offstage, unaccounted for. Speculation filled the Herald, the Tribune, the Sun. Some writers got excited by the victim's fame or the 5 shots fired. Others stared straight-faced at the date of his death, Friday, November 13th. Citizens prone to long-necked dreams carried pocket pieces on unlucky days like these, rabbit's feet and rusty screws, Pope Pius IX in a paperweight, the pit of a peach named Stump the World, items mute and immune to worry, charms to protect them from bedlam. But at the age of 83, Andrew had no time for fetishes. The things he trusted late in life were grass and trees and weeds, buildings and bridges made of stone. And after his absurd ending had faded from the news, a marble bench was erected in his name in Central Park. This small memorial can still be found overlooking the open greenery of Fort Fish. On Tuesday mornings, a person with cleaning supplies arrives to remove last week's bird shit with a brush, which is where I discovered his story. Just when I used to have time to walk around places, I found his bench in Central Park.
When we all walked around just easily everywhere. Thank you so much, Jonathan, because I do think that your opening, and there's so much more going on in this book, sets the stage for your time period. So would you talk about that for a moment? And then I will move on to our other panelists about what you wanted to convey in that opening, how you wanted us to see and understand New York at that time.
Yeah, I sort of I'm keep telling myself that for my next novel I won't write something set in deep history, because the research is so fun in some ways, but also writing about someone and trying to capture 83 years of their life, I felt like every year and almost every day required a different sort of couple months of research, because the city was changing so fast. But with that opening, I just focused on, I loved reading in the New York Times archives accounts of things that specifically happened on specific days that I wanted to set things in the book. And I loved the sort of little different newspapers perspectives on his death. And throughout the first chapter, I kind of introduced some of those. There's an Alexander Hemon book called The Lazarus Project that I really liked that sort of did something similar. And it seemed to me sort of fun to point out some of the instabilities in the historical record. Like, there are accounts that say that it was bright sunlight when he was killed, and then the New York Mirror says that it was raining, and the New York Herald is like, it was a very windy, dark, stormy day. And it's like, are people just making this up, like fiction writers? So I got interested in that. And the other thing I wanted to get across, I suppose, in setting the scene was that sense of looking back on the past. And there's that good Virginia Woolf line in her diaries where she says, I meant to write about death, but life kept breaking in as usual. And I sort of wanted from the outset for it to be a book about his death, but to just introduce more and more kind of little glimpses of the life in between the death sentences, in a way, and like all the little mistakes that happen in the accounting of events as well as the events themselves, and also have some fun with that and try and make it feel kind of bouncy and interesting, and not sort of the dusty, fusty sort of stuff that people sometimes expect from historical fiction, I guess.
It definitely, in this incredible mystery, in The Great Mistake of why he was shot, why he was murdered, there's nothing dusty or fusty or musty. I can assure everyone of that. Now, Kaitlyn, how about you? I mean, you are also writing about this historical period, and you start in New York. You start in New York City, although there's a lot going on in your book as well. And we go to Haiti in Liberty. So what did you want to immerse readers in from the get-go? Was it a certain aura of city life versus island life? Was it racism? Was it all of the above plus more? How did you want readers to find their way into Liberty's story?
Well, I think, like Jonathan sort of said, I too wanted to sort of avoid the more staid parts of historical fiction that can often happen. And I wanted the world that readers entered to feel very familiar. I didn't want to have that distance of the past. So, I tried really hard not to sort of mention like historical everyday details unless they were really necessary. So I tried really hard not to really describe the petticoats and the bonnets and all that kind of stuff. I love reading that stuff sometimes, but for this project, I wanted it to really feel as if the characters are really immediate, and the strangeness of the past wasn't necessarily in the everyday details, but in sort of these alternative ways of thinking that existed in that time period. One of the really fun parts of doing the research was reading all of these diaries and newspaper columns from people writing during Reconstruction and right after slavery, and sort of seeing all the explosion of ideas about how to live that people had, that sort of like throwing anything and everything against the wall, because you're talking about the end of a institution that was hundreds of years old that most people thought was going to last forever, and all of a sudden it's over, and there's this huge expansion of just how can we actually define our lives. And that was the sense of possibility that I wanted to capture, because I wanted to write a novel that's sort of about Reconstruction in the US, that talks around Reconstruction in the US, but I didn't want it to sort of rely on the historical irony of the reader knowing how that failed. I wanted to sort of capture the immense promise and activity and excitement that people had in that moment, that feels that felt when I was reading those accounts really similar to other historic moments that, you know, I've lived through, where it feels like, okay, finally, like things are going to change, like something's really happening here, something really exciting is happening here. I feel like I can put my excitement over here, and then, you know, over the course of time, sort of things continue to play out, and it's not as simple as that initial sort of burst of excitement.
You know, I'm going to confess here that even though I find it sort of stultifying in a way, I cannot resist watching The Gilded Age. And for this very reason, because the sense of possibility in the air in certain eras in history is so infectious. And I think that's why sometimes, and I'm really glad you brought up the bustles and hoop skirts aspect, because historical romance is certainly part of historical fiction, but it isn't all of historical fiction. And I want anyone out there, including Kaitlyn and me, because we read it too, and Quế Mai and Jonathan may as well, who knows, historical romance books can be incredibly entertaining, and some of them can really be incredibly accurate as well, but it's not the same as literary fiction that tackles history. And I think it's really important, Kaitlyn, as you were saying, to know what you're trying to bring forth for the reader. Sometimes a reader, you know, wants a lot of, you know, costume detail. Sometimes a reader, you know, wants, or dare I say needs, to know something a little bit more, to have something more to chew on, shall I say. So I really appreciate what you said. And Quế Mai, I want to give you a chance to talk about how you introduced your historical time period as well. So thank you for letting me interject for that time.
First of all, I want to thank Jonathan for a very nice reading. I love your book, Jonathan. I had no idea about Andrew Green.
Amazing.
I love Central Park. I love the New York Public Library, you know, visited many times. And I had no idea about the man who, you know, who played such an important role in giving life to these monuments and these wonderful places. And your book, you know, brought his life to life, and it was just amazing to read. So thank you. So for me, you know, I think like Jonathan and Kaitlyn, you know, who employ complicated timeline to create suspense and for their novel plot, I have done the same. So my novel opens with one of the two characters, Hương, burning incense for her grandmother in front of the family altar. So the grandmother tells Hương the challenges faced by Vietnamese people are as tall as the tallest mountains. So then the reader gets to see the first tall mountain, how to survive the American bombings of Hanoi in 1972. So each chapter then on serves as a tall mountain, how to overcome the Japanese invasion, the French occupation, the land reform, how family members reconcile while having fought opposite each other in the Vietnam War, and how to forgive each other. And I think the notion of forgiveness is important for me, because I feel like the circle of violence that we experience nowadays in the world will not stop unless there's more forgiveness, more empathy, and more understanding. And I think historical fiction has a role to play, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of wars and conflict, you know, people are normally reduced to faceless statistics. You know, they are not looked at as human beings anymore, because there's so many people who die or who are injured that they become statistics. So historical fiction enables us to travel back to the past and look at those people and live their life as well, and become a part of them. Yeah, so I think with the mountain thing, you know, I wanted to travel to the past and to continue the oral storytelling tradition of the women of Vietnam, where the grandmother tells her family story to her granddaughter, who will continue her family story. So the circle goes on. And I really believe that Vietnamese people have survived throughout history because thanks to our storytelling traditions.
Well, this is the perfect segue into your reading, Quế Mai, and then we can talk about scene setting a little bit and how important that is for characters who come from different eras. So would you read From the Mountains Sing for us, please?
Thank you. Oh, before I begin my short reading, I'd like to thank the Penn Faulkner Foundation for having me today. And I want to thank my editor, Betsy, for being here. You know, I'm really lucky to be working with Betsy. She understands Vietnam so well, and she really respects my decision, for example, to embrace the full Vietnamese tonal marks in Vietnamese language and the characters' names in my novel. And I think it's very important to me because due to colonization, you know, Vietnamese language has suffered so much loss. So whenever our language, you know, usually when Vietnamese language is published as part of the English text, it's stripped of the diacritics, and diacritics are as important as the roots of our home. They denote the little markings will define the meanings of each word. You know, for example, the word ma, M-A, means ghost. But if you add a mark like ma means mother, ma means grave, ma means young rice plant, ma means bud, ma means horse. So the little marking, the diacritics are very important, and I want to challenge, you know, the readers as well and invite them into the Vietnamese culture via my writing. And Betsy is so supportive in my mission to decolonize literature about Vietnam. So let me read a short part from page 69 of my novel. During the years that she was gone, I imagined seeing my mother again every day. I imagined disappearing into her embrace, into the river of her hair, into her soft breast. I imagined our voices rising like kites from under the shade of our new bang tree. By the beginning of 1975, rumors spread that the war was really ending. And I imagined my mother flying me down the streets of Hanoi on the back of grandma's bicycle. We would scream at the top of our lungs as the bike rushed us into a brilliant summer, into red fruit flower, into purple bang lang petals that blossomed above pavements punctured by bomb shelters. We would stop at the leg of the return word, delighting at the delirious coldness of Chang Tien ice cream. In my dream, my mother always returned with my father. He was tall and handsome. Sometimes he would rush towards me on his 2 feet. Sometimes he struggled on his single leg, leaning on a crutch. Sometimes he embraced me with his 2 strong arms. And at other times, he had no arms at all, just 2 lumps of soft flesh protruding from his shoulders. But he always laughed as he called my name. Here's Hương, my daughter. So this scene is set in Hanoi in Hương imagination. It lets the reader travel into this young girl's mind and feel her longing for her parents. So I write this book when I was away from Vietnam, you know. So I wrote this book to return home, to let homeland alive around me. I also love Hanoi so much. You know, Hanoi is the city, the capital of Vietnam, and I met my husband there and fell in love and gave birth to my 2 children there. So, but Hanoi is more than 1,000 years old, but it suffered so much, and a lot of the city was destroyed during the war. And I set that novel there because I think for me, you know, Hanoi is really the soul of Vietnam, and it bears witness to our very complicated history.
Oh, you're muted, Bethanne, I think.
Thank you. Sorry, what a rookie mistake. But what I wanted to say is that unlike Jonathan and Kaitlyn's books, Quế Mai, yours is set in the much more recent past. And sometimes we talk about things going on in the present. And I'm so sorry about that ringing telephone, everyone, really. This is a source of constant difficulty when you have two people working from home in the same house. I'm sure everyone understands. Thank you for your patience. What I want to say is that writing about the 1970s is much different than writing about the 1870s, for example. And so you were just talking, Quế Mai, about recalling a place that you know really well, yet in a different time period. And when I talk about setting in historical fiction, for example, Kaitlyn, Jonathan, we all know New York, but we don't know the New York that you're writing about, and we can research it. But what did you find out, either of you can answer this, about New York that really surprised you? That wasn't just, oh, of course, people, rode horses in the street and that kind of thing. Something that just really opened up a scene or a character or anything for you.
I guess with New York, one of the things I probably sort of knew on one level, but kept being surprised by was just like how undervalued the idea of public space has been for most of history. And thinking about the making of a great city and how far along things can get before anyone thinks, hey, it might actually be good to have like a public park that someone can go into, and or a public library. The Andrew Haswell Green, the guy at the center of the novel, he came from Massachusetts. He was sort of a farm boy. He became an apprentice at a general store in New York at the age of 15, and he couldn't find anywhere where he could sort of afford to walk because all of the pleasure gardens were ticketed. It was really expensive to get in. He couldn't find anywhere where he could indulge his interest in reading because you needed like a month's salary to be able to belong to one of these private libraries that were dotted around New York. And to see how slowly like that came about, and also finish the novel and sort of promote the novel at a time when we were thinking about public space in big cities in a different way. Mm-hmm. And just, like, appreciating when a public school was open, or appreciating like a empty beach or a park in a different way as a gathering point was kind of a cool thing to think about for me.
That is really interesting. And it also, Kaitlyn, makes me think of your scenes, well, the part of the book that's set in Haiti, and how Americans and other Westerners have such a view of Haiti now, being just impoverished and overrun with political and violent conflict. And it has a lot of problems now, but it didn't always have the same problems. It didn't always have the same layers of problems. And one of the things in Liberty that I learned, and that I and this isn't what you have to talk about, but I thought these are different layers of strata in Haiti from the ones that I know. And that must have been really interesting for you to dig into, because there's something you can't go back to, even if you visited the island, even if you knew people who'd lived there for quite a while.
Yeah, that was a real challenge when I was starting to write the book, because I was going to be writing about a period in Haitian history where there weren't that many books in English about. So we have a lot of histories of the revolution, and there's a lot of stuff published in English about Haiti, in the 20th century, both during US occupation and then later. But this sort of time period, 1870s, 1880s, was a little bit felt more daunting to research because of that. But I started to sort of read so many different accounts of, and I knew I was going to be writing about an American going to Haiti too. So that was the other challenge too. Like the character herself isn't Haitian herself. That realizing that was actually incredibly freeing, because it was like, oh, this character can make mistakes. This character can read a room completely wrong. This character can mistranslate. This character can not catch a nuance in a conversation, and it all makes sense because she's a newly arrived visitor in this country. And so once I realized that part of it, it was incredibly freeing to sort of be like, okay, then I don't have to know anything and everything about this particular time period. I just have to know as much as what the character can see, because that's how much she knows about this particular world. And so I read, like I said, I was also very lucky in that I found sort of all of these accounts of Black American missionaries going to Haiti in the late 19th and early 20th century, and their letters back and forth, and their descriptions of marketplaces, and also what the American homes look like versus what the Haitian homes look like. Just really sort of fascinating details. But what was most helpful about that too was less the particular details, but more sort of just sort of the attitudes. And what I tried to capture was, even Black Americans at that particular moment, the ones who were choosing to go to Haiti and also write about it back home, were writing from like a very particular point of view, where they had like a very particular idea of being missionaries, of sort of being their own semi-colonizing force, which is a very interesting dynamic to play with as a fiction writer. As soon as I read that, I thought, okay, there's a real tension here that's unexpected, that will be really fun to dive into, that's going to be a surprise to most readers when they sort of pick this up.
Well, that is the perfect segue into your reading. And I want to hear about how the perspective from which you write changes the story you tell. And of course, I'm talking about the complete elimination of the white gaze in Liberty, but I might be also talking about eliminating other things, as you just were. And I know you're going to read a scene that takes place in the States about the draft riots, that it's very relevant. So Kaitlyn, and please feel free to introduce it any way you like. My intro is insufficient.
Well, that's my fault. I didn't tell you what I was reading until like 20 minutes ago. So well, I apologize for that. Okay. So I'm going to be reading from a section of the book. It's about maybe like a third into the book. And the main character, Liberty, is in her teens, and it takes place during the Civil War. And she lives in Kings County, what's now considered Brooklyn. And so she's a little bit removed from the war, also because she's living in this free Black village that's based on Weeksville, that was in central Brooklyn, starting in the 1830s. So her first experience sort of with the war is she's seeing refugees come from Manhattan to Brooklyn, escaping the draft riots, which took place in July of 1863, where white mobs in Manhattan attacked both Black businesses and Black businesses, homes, and institutions, and their white allies, and just intense violence. They burned the orphanage, and just sort of like a really violent insurrection in the middle of the Civil War. So I'm gonna read the section where Liberty, she's at the waterfront in downtown Brooklyn, waiting to sort of see who's made it across the river to Brooklyn the morning after the first night of the riots. When we got to the waterfront, the whole stretch was empty. There were no boats. "Where are they all?" Miss Dinah said, and only the waves slapping the bottom of the wharf answered her. By then it was just after dawn. The water before us was first a long line of silver, and then a sudden wall of cloud and fog. The smoke from all the fires the whites had set was rolling over to us across the wide expanse of river, and it mixed with the muggy July dawn until one swirling mass of white and gray set on top of the water. I had never seen smoke mix with fog like that before, how it hovered like a curtain between this world and maybe the next, from light to dark, from heaven to hell, from sleep to consciousness. This was where the woman in the water lived. Even now, I knew it. I knew it in my bones, and I felt how foolishly I had spent the last year looking for her in common well water when she was here all along. When I stood with the women on the dock as they tried to see what was coming to them through the veil, I prayed to her, that woman, let him through, let him through, let him through. I heard the tiniest drop of a wave, the sound a fish makes when it turns over on the surface of the water and falls back to its home. Was that her? Was that her byword? I thought it was. I knew it was because the next thing I saw finally was something nosing its way through the clouds. It was a long boat with 4 rowers, 2 at the bow, 2 at the stern, followed by 2 more. As they got closer, I could see that the rowers had kerchiefs wrapped around their mouths to keep from breathing in the smoke as they worked, and their hats pulled down over their eyes to keep them from stinging in the wind. Between the rowers on the boats were tens of children, and what was most eerie about it all was that the only sound was the water slapping the oars. Even the babies were silent. But then the first boat docked, and the women all around me took in a deep breath, and they began to sing. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. By the time we got to the chorus, a baby in one of the boats began to cry, a big robust yell, as if he was trying to harmonize with us. And the women all around me broke out in whoops. That's it, Miss Annie called out. Keep it up. And then the other babies began to cry as well. And I have never seen a group of women happier to hear a bunch of infants bawling at 5 a.m. I'll stop there. Oh, you're still muted.
Here I go again. I just got this message in all caps, unmute. I'm sorry, I was really lost in that passage. Sorry, everyone. So I have just been sort of asking you, Kaitlyn, about this, but all 3 of you could talk about this. What was your biggest surprise? The thing, I know, Jonathan, you talked about open spaces and green spaces, but what was the thing in researching these books that just made you, either it was completely unexpected or it gave you that shiver, like you knew that you'd found a key to unlocking something, if that makes sense?
Well, for me, it was, a bunch of different things. I think, in the passage I just read, there's sort of a reference to a woman in the water. And for me, when I was studying the book in Haiti, I knew that I wanted to write something about Voodoo, but I didn't really know how I was going to do that in a way that would make sense for the characters, because I didn't want this to be a magical realist novel necessarily. Mm-hmm. And so as sort of I read more about that religious practice and its origins and sort of the echoes back and forth across the Atlantic, I'd sort of I'd read about it before, and so I knew that those sort of echoes existed, but it was just really satisfying to sort of see it in the research, and it was a really fun thing to play with the characters to figure out how they were going to sort of feel this overarching way of sort of ordering the universe and ordering their ways in it that made sense for both Haiti and New York City.
And yet has nothing to do with the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Completely mm-hmm. outside of that. That's really, really amazing. How about you, Quế Mai?
Yeah, so for me, I interviewed hundreds of people for the Mountain Sing, mm-hmm. and I'm really surprised how willing they were to share their stories with me. It was just incredible because I think because people have buried a lot of trauma inside of themselves, so I think they felt the need to share. And if you know the right question to ask, you can open like rivers and streams of stories. People they could have spent days talking with me, and one of the most astonishing stories that my close friend, one of my closest friends shared with me was of how her own grandmother had to run away from the land reform, and she had to abandon one child after the next to strangers to keep them alive. And when I heard the story, I knew I had to fictionalize it somehow. So that's the story of Grandma Diệu Lan. And the incredible thing is that when the book is published, so many Vietnamese have contacted me and said, our family went through similar things. There are so many people who had to walk hundreds of kilometers, doing these atrocities to be able to survive. And we shared so much of the community trauma, of this trauma that need to be talked about, that need to be discussed. Yeah,
I don't like the reason that they wanted to tell their stories, but I love that you brought up the thing that being surprising was hearing, from these people, hearing stories, collecting stories. That's really powerful. And it's a really powerful, it's material for historical fiction, but it's also a reason for writing this kind of literary fiction. And that's amazing, Quế Mai. Thank you. And Jonathan, that makes me think about something for The Great Mistake. There are so many different angles to approach, but one of the quite interesting things I think in The Great Mistake is in the braided narrative, if you will. One of the places and its people we learn about is a brothel, a very upscale brothel. And so I wondered about what was surprising to you about researching an establishment like that. And that sort of, I don't even want to call it an underworld. It was just part of life, but it was certainly not part of the, drawing room, business dealing, high finance kind of life. It was a different aspect.
Yeah, that took me by surprise too, and was a sort of interesting thing in the research, that I was trying to reinvestigate why this murder had taken place of Andrew Haswell Green. And he was shot by a man named Cornelius Williams, and then it turned out that Cornelius Williams was in love with a woman named Bessie Davis, and her real name was Hannah Elias, but she went by the name Bessie Davis. And there are all these like little mistakes where when you're writing a book called The Great Mistake, like I'm rubbish at titles, but when I pick a title, I'm like, I better look out for stuff that connects to that title. And there are all these sort of little mistakes and miscommunications, including, it's not much of a spoiler, he was shot in a case of mistaken identity, because Cornelius Williams was actually, it turns out he knew that there was a Green who'd been involved with Hannah Elias, and he looked him up in the phone book and picked the wrong Green and shot the wrong Green. But she was a fascinating character because she became known as the richest Black woman in America in the 1880s. And she ran this Central Park adjacent brothel that was frequented by a lot of the politicians of the day. And there were little snippets of interviews from her from when the scandal broke. And, she's not a huge part of the book, but in these interviews, she brought so much humor to the situation. There was this sort of sense that like a white guy was dead and she was the only one who wasn't really fazed by it. She was like, well, you should see some of the things that I've seen
right
in the last few years. And also just another surprise just in all of the research, I suppose, was I was reminding myself constantly that whenever I came across anything that was humorous, anything that was like, that made me laugh, that's like a huge thing when you're looking at the past. Somehow I found, like, maybe it connects to Kaitlyn's point about like trying not to be staid. Like the flip of it is like when you find something that makes you laugh in history, I think it reminds you that there are patterns of mistakes and errors and misunderstandings and things like that are sort of funny throughout the ages. There was a bunch of board minutes from the New York City Board of Education that I spent a lot of time going through. And I was on sort of day 3 of reading these really boring board minutes that I felt like I needed to read. And there was a line at the end of one of the sets of board minutes that said, "A moving tribute was also paid by the chair of the board today to Alderman Lucas, who died last week after lighting a firework in the mistaken belief that it was a cigar." And I was like, that there are just those moments, and it's like, you know, bad luck for Alderman Lucas's family, but these little moments of joy that sort of leap off the page in research sometimes. And I tried to make some space for those too.
You know, we were talking about tweets earlier, and it just, when you're talking to me, tweets come up. I saw something about a log, and maybe it was Ellis Island, maybe it was somewhere else, but it was basically a log of names and birth dates and then occupations. And this particular one on Twitter shows a woman's name. She's maybe 18 years old, and under occupation it says does as she pleases. And I thought, they're squad goals. You know? That is a lot. Yeah, there are little bits, you know, everywhere that even if they're not flat out humor, they can, you know, remind us that life has a lot of humor in it. And I think I see that in, you know, all of your books. I want to remind everyone who is with us that there is plenty of time for questions, so please ask them. But since we only have a couple right now, I'm going to go on and ask a few more questions since we have a little time. And I have these authors, my captives, on Zoom. So who are your greatest influences, each of you, especially when it comes to historical fiction? I mean, you can tell me that, you know, you love this author or that author, but if it's someone who also writes literary fiction of the historical type, I'd love to hear about that. So influences. Anyone? Jonathan, you start this time. Don't make Kaitlyn sit.
Yeah, my mind always goes completely blank, even though I think you warned us that this question might be coming. But I mean, I love this like doctoro ragtime, you know, that sort of mischievous blending of fact and fiction in that kind of historical work. I always read Zadie Smith's work, and even though she's rarely sort of spoken about as a historical novelist, even though I think her next book is kind of set in deep history, I think she always peels back history in fascinating ways. Toni Morrison's jazz is just, you know, obviously a brilliant look at Harlem history that sort of improvises the spaces between the past and the present in really cool ways. I read a lot of Joseph Mitchell's old kind of New Yorker profiles as well, which also turn out to be as much fiction as they are fact, but there's something in the tone of those that spoke to me when I was trying to work on this book.
Up at the Old Hotel is just so marvelous. Love Joseph Mitchell. How about you, Kaitlyn?
Well, for this book, I was really trying to think of like historical fiction books that do really interesting things around language. And so Coming Through Slaughter was really important to read. You know, that book does such sort of just marvelous things of just pulling you really into a world. And True History of the Kelly Gang does the same. You know, that's a book where Peter Carey is using just the complete sort of alien nature of reading like language from the past to really, it almost pushes you out at first, and then you're all of a sudden you're in this voice that is just remarkable and so different from anything else. And then I was also trying to read books that you know, came out a long time ago and are set in an era different from the authors. So I think I talked about this with you in our interview, but like Age of Innocence is to me like a classic historical fiction novel. I don't think many people think of it that way, but you know, Wharton was writing about a time, you know, 40 years before when she was sort of writing and publishing it. And so I've tried to sort of think of those sorts of books, like books that are clearly set away from the author's time period, but for whatever reason, sort of we don't necessarily think of them as historical fiction, or we think of them just sort of as, you know, this is the world and we're in it, and it doesn't necessarily have those expectations around it.
Well, and so much of what we consider great literature, we don't think of it as historical fiction because we don't keep timelines in our heads very well, do we?
Right.
So like the Hunchback of Notre Dame is set in the 15th century, and Hugo, of course, was, you know, squarely living in the 19th.
Right.
But we don't think of that. So that's another challenge, I think, when we're talking about influences, because so many writers from the past, just historical fiction was it for them. They were just naturally writing about the past. They moved back and forth, and historical fiction also. And Quế Mai, this is where I come to you and your influences. I mean, think of, you know, there is Chinese historical writing going back thousands of years. In Japan, Tale of Genji can be considered historical. I am not cool enough to know the best historical novel writing in Vietnam, but I'm going to learn more from you. So tell us, Quế Mai, about some of your influences, whether they are available in English or not, because who knows what will come next in translation.
Thank you so much, Bethanne. You know, for me, the poets of Vietnam actually are the ones who are inspirational to me. You know, the poets who tell great historical fiction via their poetry. For example, you know, you may check out Nguyễn Du's The Tale of Kiều, which has been translated into English. So Nguyễn Du wrote about the Tale of Kiều, which is, you know, which documents the life of this woman named Kiều in an epic poem of 3,254 verses.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, in the traditional Vietnamese format, like 6x8. So, you know, it's the greatest work of literature for Vietnamese people. And a lot of Vietnamese know this book by heart, and we tell our fortune with this book.
Really?
Yeah, so it's a part of our culture. So the two historical fiction writers whom I really love are Bảo Ninh, who wrote The Sorrow of War. So Bảo Ninh was a soldier, you know, for the Northern Vietnamese army, and most of the comrades in his unit died, and he went through so much, and he wrote this book, The Sorrow of War, which was banned in Vietnam at first because the government said there was no sorrow, we won the war. So he was the first writer from North Vietnam to write about the trauma of war. So the book, when it was allowed to be published in Vietnam, they changed the title to The Fate of Love, from the sorrow of war to the fate of love, because there's a love story in the novel.
Is that available in English?
Yeah, The Sorrow of War is one of the top books from Vietnam.
I am definitely going to be looking that one up myself. Absolutely. This is great. And I know we have a couple more questions, but there are a couple more things I wanted to ask, and I think we have just a few minutes, but before I do that, let's answer the questions so I make sure we don't run out of time. So Elizabeth McLean asks you, Quế Mai, you say the war lives in the consciousness of your people. Will there be a follow-up to The Mountains Sing? What lives have your protagonists built in post-war Vietnam? Where are they now?
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth McLean is a great novelist who's from Canada. So hi, Elizabeth. And thank you to all our audience members who are joining us from all around the world. I think the magical thing about Zoom is that, you know, you can have people from everywhere. So thank you for joining us today. Yeah, many readers have wanted to know what happened to a few people from the novel, because like the Vietnam War, we haven't resolved many things, you know, like the Vietnamese history, there are still so many things unburied. So for example, there are still people who are missing from the book. So I think at the moment, I want the reader to imagine the lives of those characters. Maybe one day I write a sequel. I don't know yet, but at the moment, I feel like there's so much of Vietnamese history I want to know. Like Jonathan said before, you either write what you know or what you want to know. And there's so much I want to learn and I want to research. For example, one of the topics I want to research into is human trafficking, because Vietnam is one of the destination countries for human trafficking. So many Vietnamese women are trafficked for prostitution every year, for exploitation of labor as well. So you may have heard about this terrible situation when many Vietnamese died in the back of a truck in the UK because they were being trafficked. It's happening every day, and it has serious implications. So I want to, because I worked on human trafficking a while ago, and I want to go back and research about it. But thank you so much, Elizabeth.
I really hope you do. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that question. And I want to make a recommendation of my own. I looked up a definition of historical fiction before we started tonight, and basically it's 25 years. Give or take. People are doing all kinds of things. But one book that I read last year came out in October 2021 that I think is a marvelous example of historical fiction. The kind we're talking about is by the Finnish author Sophie Oksanen. Actually, she's Estonian Finnish. And she wrote a book called Dog Park that is set in Ukraine. And it's about Russian trafficking in Ukraine and Estonia. And it's a very, very powerful book. And it is, because it's set in the 90s, it is historical fiction, but it comes a little bit more into present day. So that's a recommendation for everyone. And we have another question from Alicia Rosano, who asks, a very, very long time ago, a lecturer I heard described historical fiction as inherently contradictory, meaning history and fiction, perhaps. Do you think of your writing, and this is for all our panelists, as in this in-between space of fiction and nonfiction? How does this understanding affect the way you approach different projects? And I just want to say, that's a great question. I hope you will all answer it. And Jonathan said something a few minutes ago that was very interesting about Joseph Mitchell and his writing. And I thought there's a certain kind of, some writing has the historical approach and the fictional approach. Some historical fiction is entirely fictional. It's a very hard thing to answer. So, but I look forward to hearing what each of you have to say about that. Kaitlyn? Anything about being in that space between history and fiction?
I'm trying to think of the best way to answer it, because I feel like the two are so closely aligned for me. And, I feel like so many historians talk about sort of working and inventing and elaborating on the silences in archives. And so for me, in many ways, fiction and history are sort of doing very similar work, especially when you're talking about trying to uncover histories of marginalized people or people who are usually sort of left out of general greater historical narratives. So yeah, I feel like the two are so closely aligned in my mind, which feels like a strange thing to say, because I feel like so much of history as well, I don't know. I don't want to discount from the real work that historians do of sort of establishing facts and stuff, but this idea of having to create a narrative out of these very sort of different shards of information that you have feels very similar to fiction for me.
Okay, Mai?
That's a great question, Alicia. I think the job of a novelist is to plant a tree, and I think the foundation of our work, the garden on which we plant a tree, views from our nonfiction research. I think we get we gather information about real life events about history, about the lives of people in the past, so that we build the foundation for our garden. But with our creative techniques, we build our trees, we use our plot, our imagination, our narrative, our voices. We build the trunk and the branches and give leaves to our tree. But I think readers have a great role, you know, in the development of historical fiction. It's the interaction of the readers, the participation of the readers that give the flowers and fruit to the tree. Because without readers, there's no literature. So I think, you know, yeah, I think that there's something in between there. And I want to talk about this book by Kim Thuy, who's a Vietnamese Canadian writer, and her new book called EM is a mix of fiction and non-fiction. It's a short book, but it's about, you know, the history of Vietnam from the French occupation to current day. And, you know, she has many statistics in there that read exactly like non-fiction, but this is a book of fiction as well. So, you know, also Ocean Vuong, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Even though, you know, this is a book of fiction, but it's also a mix of memoir, non-fiction. So it's really interesting. And I think, you know, this is a form which is being developed and employed much more. And I love to see that. I love to see the creativity and how we have no border anymore, but you know, like we can reach all the borders, we can erase all the limitations and be free with our creativity and our imagination.
And I want to mention, Quế Mai, that it was recently nominated for a Penn International Books in Translation Award. So that's very exciting. We should all be looking out for it. And Jonathan, I'll just ask you for your response. And in a moment, I'm going to let everyone go back to life, real life, not historical life.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I agree with everything everyone said. I think that there's a sense in which it's part of the fun or the interest that we'll probably all have in historical fiction, is that there are ways in which the past is as much a work of imagination as the future. And there's also interesting things to peel back in terms of the beauties and dangers of narrative. And, you know, the worst things that have happened in American history were acts of narrative imagination, sometimes horrible acts, you know, that someone came up with, twistings of stories or suppressions of imagination or distortions of the truth or of people's individual truths and free speech. The epigraph I have for the novel is a novelist quote, which goes along the lines of novels arise from the shortcomings of history. And I think there is something in, you know, the novelist being able to show you not just what happened, but how it felt. I think great biographers do that too, of course. But one historian said to me at an event that he feels that history arises from the shortcomings of novels, and that might be true too.
That is the perfect way to end our panel on storied history. Thank you, Kaitlyn Greenidge, Jonathan Lee, and Quế Mai for your time and patience this evening, and for all of the responses you've given. I think we've all learned a lot. And thank you to our audience. And I am going to turn things over to Shahenda Helmy, our Penn Faulkner Programs Director, for a few words at the end. Thank you, Shahenda, for being here to say goodbye to everyone.
Thank you so much, Bethanne, for that introduction and for leading tonight's conversation so beautifully. You're absolutely right. We learned so much. And thank you to our amazing panelists for joining us from quite literally all over the world tonight. We didn't mention it explicitly, but Quế Mai is actually here joining us from Kyrgyzstan, where it is currently tomorrow morning. So thank you all, Kaitlyn, Jonathan, Quế Mai. It really means the world to us to have you here. And of course, a huge thanks to you, our audience at the other end of the screen, for engaging with us through your time and your thoughtful questions. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to Penn Faulkner using the link we'll drop in the chat shortly. Any amount you give will help us to continue to provide high quality literary programs like tonight's literary conversations, as well as through our awards programs and our education programs year round. You can learn more about Penn Faulkner's work by visiting our website at pennfaulkner.org and by following us on social media. Once again, thank you all for being a part of our literary family, and we hope to see you all again soon. Have a good night, everyone.